So, no, thanks for joining. This was there was a lot to take in this book. I know, Ken, you just started saying that it was a bit depressing to listen to. Reading, it was there was points that it got depressing too, but
Yeah.
but I liked about it. There's a lot to talk about, I think. And I'd be interested, obviously, in everyone's impressions and things that kind of caught your attention. But I thought a good place to start was, his schema in terms of the generations of federalism. And, I think the general theme of the book is the services you get, it depends on where you live. And because of that, federalism is making our nation more inequitable each and every day. But he started it off with the schematic, with the first generation, second generation, third and fourth, and I like that as a jumping off point. Something that I'd be interested in your opinion is the eras he chose. I think it made sense to me, starting with the 10th Amendment and then again the 14th Amendment and then how the states interpreted that to their own want. And then the third, I thought was a pretty narrow banded generation from, Brown, obviously as a reaction to Plessy versus Ferguson into 1968. And he does mention the new era, but I mean, for me, certainly that was a time where I think using his words, the Hamiltonian model of federalism was maybe its strongest. And then, going into World War II. So I just interesting kind of the epics he chose. Just kind of wanted to get your opinions, or even if you thought his idea that it is cyclical is actually something that resonated with you.
Well, it definitely did with me, and going all the way back to the formation, the cyclical nature and things coming back to haunt us, which is that's why the depressing comment came. Because go back to the founding, why do we have a proportional representation in one house and non-proportional in the Senate? It was because that's the only way they could agree to form a nation, basically. That trade-off between power interests outside the big cities, basically. And here we are today experiencing the very same thing.
I'm not sure if I agree with the argument that it is cyclical in nature. It has two ways to go. Sometimes it'll go one way, or other ways it'll go the other way. And I think it'll just over time it'll naturally fluctuate. But I don't think there's sort of anything that is sort of setting it one way or the other.
So you're more a pendulum as opposed to circular?
I think it goes back and forth without any particular rhyme or reason. Like I don't I think the way he presented it, like it was swinging back and forth like a natural sort of fluctuation, and I don't agree with that.
And breaking it down in those different generations, I like how he frames it at the beginning with the Thurgood Marshall quote. I think it was like during his bicentennial speech or whatever it was, about how, everyone expected him to kind of say all these platitudes about the founding fathers. And
he ripped into them.
Yeah. And he says basically like they didn't get it right and it still isn't right. And then I think those generations kind of kept for me going back to that. Like they didn't get it right. And these are all more attempts to try to get it right that are failing, so.
Yeah. So one of the things that I thought about in the book is I read a book by Rahm Emanuel, who was the former Obama chief of staff, former Chicago mayor. And one of the theses of his book was, the national government is a relatively new invention, and there's no reason to think that it is a permanent way of doing things. And his thesis was we're devolving back to the local level rather than strengthening on the national level. So I'm, I'm more of a fan of that argument than the sort of swinging back and forth at the federal level and federalism.
Yeah, I mean, part of me, with that argument is, if I understand it, kind of devolving, kind of it's from this notion of a federal politic to where we are now. It's interesting when what he chose for me in the fourth generation is, as best I could tell, is Medicaid, which was an interesting jumping off point, I thought. I mean, to me, a lot of it is based on distrust, and it's the same time as Vietnam. I mean, I don't know if we ever recovered from that, in terms of, could we ever trust, could we ever have a Hamiltonian model where we really, as a nation, can pull in the same direction. Medicaid certainly is interesting, and I know professionally I'm involved in it a lot. And in ways I actually think it's interesting, and he mentions it too, in ways that it does allow for experimentation in different states. But and he mentions it, but there's such a notion of distrust that I don't know if we can if we can return to a place where we can kind of imbue more of that Hamilton model.
Yeah, and a lot of going to that Hamilton model with the social programs and all that. It's interesting how he ties in the conversation about post World War II in the United States, and kind of like the anti-socialism, like they're so afraid of going with the national programs because they were afraid of connecting themselves with socialism, and that was a terrible thing in the post World War II era. And then comparing to the European countries, even our allies who embraced that, and where they are now, I think that's the history that a lot of people currently forget about. But at the same time, that same sentiment is there. The anything that's a social program, is we're going to turn to a socialist country.
Well, yeah, back in the day, before I was born, people used to say, well, Mr. Roosevelt's ruining the country. They were talking about FDR. And it was that same 20-30% of the population that yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if folks who thought Mr. Roosevelt was ruining the country are now saying, I'm not going to take that vaccine because the wrong guy told me to take it.
Since we're talking about sort of history now, I just had a question for the historians among you, and it was chapter 3, the section labeled, the subsection is called The Birth of Federal Grants. The Birth of Federal Grants, it's page 44. And over on page 47, I have a little sticky note questioning something, because he wrote about how the federal government was using carrots because it really didn't have the sticks. It didn't have regulatory power. And he wrote, the results were remarkable. New roads and harbors popped up along with better schools and expanded trade. The Erie Canal connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, and from there to the Atlantic Ocean, and that opened up the rapidly emerging West. Well, the federal government didn't pay any money into the Erie Canal. Was my understanding that New York went to New York went to Thomas Jefferson, asked for help, and Thomas Jefferson said, you won't have a canal in New York State that's for the next 100 years from now. And New Yorkers went back and said, to hell with Thomas Jefferson and the federal government. We're building this canal with our own money, and raised bonds. And it was one of the few canals that actually made money and didn't go bust. So correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding of the history. And he's trying, the Erie Canal was one of the great accomplishments of New York State. And I think he's trying to say it's because the federal government helped. And you see, that's a spurious argument, isn't it? If in fact we paid for it, Governor Clinton and his group paid for it all themselves, then this is a real problem with his argument.
Yeah, I would agree on the Erie Canal example, because that was kind of a New York thing. But in terms of the overall concept, the interstate highway system, in terms of the incentives making things happen, sewage treatment. I mean, we in the 60s and 70s, before the Environmental Protection Act and Clean Water Act, most municipalities were basically dumping our effluent into rivers and streams and seas. And that's no longer the case. And the drinking water, even though we've got issues with lead and so forth, had that not evolved, and that was federal heavy duty federal incentives. The federal government was offering grants to fund roughly 80% of the cost to build a sewage treatment plant when they were first starting to build them. And the reason I know this is that my first job as an intern with the GAO was participating on a study where we literally were visiting sewage treatment plants in California, up and down the state. And the main query was, were you setting aside enough reserves to replace what the federal government helped you build with 80% funding? And of course, the answer to that was no, they weren't.
Yeah,
but
I agree with you, Ken.
Yeah.
It's just that he uses this example in chapter 3.
Yeah,
when
it's not a
he's
good
talking
example.
about the beginning of federal grants. So he's not talking about the era of cooperative federalism that starts with FDR and then proceeds through LBJ. He's trying to establish that the federal government did this right away.
Yeah,
And
I think that's an error.
I think it's an error. I think he's got a factual error here. That's all. Maybe I'm being too picky, but I think
No, not at all.
I'm from a canal town. I went to Fairport High School. It's on the Erie Canal, the barge canal, and it was a big part of my upbringing, canal lore. And
I didn't know that about Thomas Jefferson. That's interesting.
Yeah, and some people thought it was because he only wanted to help Virginia.
Yeah.
He didn't want New York to progress.
Well, a lot of that back and to this day, it's horse trading between states. If he wanted something for Virginia, he knew he might have to give some aid to help New York with its project, whether it be the canal or not. But yeah, my recollection of reading about the canal is it was largely, I don't know what role the federal government has, but I don't think principle would be a word that you could use. Huh, that's interesting. Be something to look up after tonight.
Yeah, I didn't write to him or anything because I didn't want to, but I've read a few books on the Erie Canal, and that was always my understanding, that's what was so wonderful about it, is that we didn't need federal help, that it's something that for New Yorkers to be proud of in our history, that we did it all on our own and we had the get up and go to do it.
Right.
I've got to mute.
I thought he did a pretty good job of touching on America's original sin, as he puts it, and the slavery issue and tying that in without getting too caught in the weeds. Somehow he was able to bring that conversation into play and keep the conversation rolling with the focus on federalism, which I could see how it could be really easy to just get stuck on that and just there's so much to cover there,
Mm-hmm. And it makes you realize how, solving those, minute, or not minute, but those political problems back in, the 1700s have, affected everything that we've done today for our government. Why we have two houses, for example. It was to solve a political problem that existed at that particular point in time, and we're still dealing with those consequences.
Yeah,
that's right.
To just look at it as this, what's politically expedient right now to make this deal happen, and we'll deal with this terrible thing when we can. And, and I couldn't help but wonder if that's really the way he felt about it, because he did touch on that too, because he said, well, Madison did own slaves, so how deeply he felt against slavery is another discussion, but he kind of just breezes right past it, right?
Well, that's rural urban divide too. You know, I mean, we have the two houses because of slavery and because the slave states didn't have a majority of the population, not even close, and they wanted to retain their power and their control.
Mhm. But you know how that sort of now we're dealing with a different type of inequity, and it just sort of calls into question whether federalism is the right solution to solve these problems of just the gaps between the states, between the affluent states and the less affluent states.
Yeah, I agree with Brian's point. It really struck me that his argument was a little simplistic. In other words, he takes one variable, which is governance, and that's supposed to explain everything. But of course, we all know that we are a coastal nation. Most people live along the Great Lakes, the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific, and the Gulf for a reason. And there are all sorts of advantages that people have living in different places. And to expect government, because that's what I got out of it, that this was a very progressive liberal argument. And I said to myself, well, this is absolutely impossible what he's suggesting. And I thought back to that old book, The Calculus of Consent by James Buchanan, and the guys who were big in George Mason University, because they're more like the farmer instead of the Federalist, right? George Mason University, George Mason was, defended the Articles of Confederation. And so I thought, and so I was really looking for a solution. I hope I'm not jumping too far ahead, but I really felt kind of cheated in the last chapter, because I felt he didn't really provide us a solution to the problem he seemed to be identifying, which I thought was primarily race-based, although I kept asking myself, what about rural versus urban, what Ken's been bringing up, because that seems to be so much part of the divide today. It isn't all about race, it's also about the rural part of the country being left, the supposedly flyover areas of the country. I'll mute now.
Yeah, chapter 10, he does a real good teeing up everything. Everything kind of brings everything in. It's a great long chapter, covers everything. And then you get the last chapter and it's like, well, wait a minute. Wait, why are we talking about TV reality personalities and politics? like where's the deeper conversation? But I guess maybe he was just trying to be more thought provoking with the book than, solution minded anyhow. I don't know.
Well, I was, when I was reading, I was thinking like, is the problem that he's identifying, is that a symptom of the disease or is that the cause of the disease? And my feeling is, he was, the problem, the divided states of America is it's a symptom of a larger disease rather than the cause of it itself. The federalism structure, that is to say.
Yeah.
The part that I tend to think he had a point on is this whole the structure was set up to accommodate mortally opposing power structures and points of view. And when it first happened, it was the slave states who were primarily agricultural and rural. But slavery made their economy go, and they weren't willing to give it up. And you have the northern industrial states and with larger population base, and that's how they came up with the structure. And we're having the same problems now. The House just voted to proceed with making Washington, D.C. a state. It would be bigger than, I believe, 4 or 5 others. And yet the chances of it getting through the Senate are iffy at best. Yeah, so we're still dealing with that today. And maybe the reason he couldn't really come up with much solutions in the last chapter is I'm kind of bereft to come up with one myself.
Mhm. Well, he makes a point of pointing to different states who are inventive, like California and Wisconsin, and I forget his other example. But then he backs off of that. It seems like that to me could have been a potential solution. Is how the federal government can serve to perhaps highlight that, or I guess what Clinton did, he kind of did an end around the welfare issue, but. It's thinking of solutions is how to distill what's going on in other states that's working. And I only speak because I work for New York State, and I just had an experience where I work for the Office of Mental Health, and we are in our own silo, which I imagine there's 49 other silos, and there was a presentation of the crisis system in Arizona. And I think, there's a certain level of conceit in New York State about, being a progressive state, and Arizona perhaps being a purple state at best. And I was blown away. And, it's like, how can the federal government serve to distill what is happening out there? I mean, what vehicle can we use? And I don't know. It's just, it seemed like he was trying to make an argument from that, but then kind of backed off of it, or at least didn't find the vehicle to make that work.
He's kind of pointing that there's no really other way to get anything done right now, right? Other than the waiver system and let the states, I think he calls it the cauldron, all these difficult issues, let them simmer in the cauldron of state experimentation. And, but then you're right. Then he backs off of that and kind of hints toward going back stronger federal. How do you reconcile those two?
Yeah, I think that part of it too, the Medicaid approach was a good example to see what the potential is for state experimentation. And it made me think that, there's a lot to be said to that with a big, huge proviso. You need to set some floors that are higher than the basement that we have now in some states.
Right.
I mean, if you're on Medicaid in Alabama or Mississippi, you're in deep trouble, and your life is probably going to be years shorter than if you're on Medicaid in New York. Does that mean New York's Medicaid program is particularly well run? Well, probably not. But is the lifespan of somebody who's in that system in New York likely to be longer than someone in one of these poor states? Yeah, probably is. And so it's kind of like you want to be able to take the best of the experimentation, but set a floor so that you have at least nationally some minimums. It's healthcare is a real problem in this country, and it's one of those things where the very federalism that we've set up makes it harder to solve the problem that most other major developed countries in this world have been dealing far more successfully for decades.
But then you look at something like Medicaid, and I guess there's a benefit to having different states sort of tailor their programs and sort of each is allowed to innovate. But at the end of the day, the states that are have the most successful programs are the ones who have the most money. The ones that are least successful have the least amount of money. So it's not rocket science to figure out what makes a more successful program or not. And because we are sharing the cost between the federal government and the state government, that's the cause of the problems. Because how much are we going to ask the rich states to subsidize the poor states?
Right.
We do in a sense, right? Because I know Mississippi pays less to the federal government than New York does for Medicaid, right? But that only goes so far, in terms of what the state matches. I mean, then it comes down to, unfortunately, the values of those being elected in that state. It's, you know, it's a value decision too. And that's what's really difficult. I mean, the example of Alabama, you know, and hookworm, I think it was, is just,
Yeah.
But
You
one
know.
of the things I couldn't tell in the book was like, was Kettl arguing that, you know, because these states are poor, that's why they're not investing in the programs? Because that's how I read it, but I'm not sure if I read it correctly.
Yeah, I think he explicitly says the states that spend more have better outcomes.
But are the reason that the states that spend less, is the reason some states spend less is because they're poor? You know what I mean? Because, you know, are they more apt to elect politicians who are anti-government?
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah, I think that's very true.
Yeah, it was interesting though to look at maybe the exceptions. You know, just thinking of the chart, like Iowa was one of the states that you know, is traditionally a blue state. It's a relatively wealthy state, but I mean, they were doing something right. You know, it's those states that were anomalies in that graph that I thought was interesting. What is Iowa doing? That's you know, unique. Or what's Texas doing wrong? You know. Or Alaska, which is a relatively wealthy state. You know, kind of to get underneath those states that were anomalies, you know, where Connecticut is, you know, and then where Mississippi is. But there were states that were kind of, oh, you know, I just remember Iowa. Iowa, you know, what's, you know, a very, very conservative state, but, you know, in terms of outcomes, at least the way they were measured, it's consistent with the Connecticut's and the whatever, the Vermonts. So, I wish that would have been okay through this chart, you know, focusing more on those who are doing something different and right, or different and wrong. You know, like Mississippi is, you know, I mean, what can you do?
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with the floor argument, is that I mean, you're right. The better outcomes are going to be associated with the states that are spending more per capita. But is the differential between if New York is 100%, is there a significant differential between the states that are spending, say, 80% of what New York spends per capita versus Mississippi, which is probably at 25%? I mean, it's obviously you're not going to get the results when you're spending so little money, but there may very well be. I would be surprised if either New York or California are exemplars of the most efficiently run Medicaid systems in the country. But their results are better because they're spending a whole lot of money.
Yeah.
Question is, could be a little bit less. And then the other side of that is, no matter where they are, everything's in the environment of a healthcare system that nobody can afford.
Right. Well, when he chose the two national issues to focus on, he chose healthcare and environment. But he was also talking about inequities, and he never talked about fiscal policy or tax policy. And to me, that's the most direct way that the federal government can get at those issues. And
we're having a demonstration of that right now.
Right. Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Well, I have a question since you mentioned the environment. I mean, Kettl comes close to saying, well, I think he actually says it, the waiver system is too liberal. By that, there's too many waivers. And he uses the environment as an example, but I really was disappointed by his example, because he uses California as an example. And of course, we've just suffered under the Trump administration that was fighting California's high standards. And of course, New York and other states have, but California has been the leader. And Kettl explicitly objects to California being the leader. But California has more people than the country, than Canada, than most countries in the world. And California is probably, what is it, the sixth highest GNP? I think we're number 11.
It's 5 or 6. You're right,
5 or
Lori.
6. I'd have to look on Wikipedia what the numbers are this year. And we're like 11 or 12 in New York State. And this is my point. In the environment, it's a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. So for instance, Germany had to adopt California's standards because of the catalytic converter. So I'm trying to say is that when you look across federal or quasi-federal systems, Germany and California look a lot alike, and Mississippi and Greece look a lot alike. That's just how it is. And do the people in Mississippi want more air pollution and more water pollution? No, California set the standards. There's a reason why Nixon was the president who pushed and signed the Clean Water Act. He was a Californian. Didn't matter that he was Republican. Republicans were different then. And so my point is that I think the waiver system is good. I think it's especially good in the environment. I think it's been demonstrated by California and some other states like New York. And then it sets standards for the world, places like Germany. And then Germany sets the standards for the European Union, because, you know, I don't know if you know this, but all environmental regulations are made in Brussels. They're not made in the individual member states of the EU. So it's a system that, I mean, they have the implementation is at the state level, just like here. We have our DEC, but so much of what DEC is doing is implementing federal standards. And we're permitted through waivers to have higher standards than that federal floor. I don't see a problem with it. If you don't like the air in Mississippi, move to California or New York or Massachusetts. And then Mississippi is forced to, or the federal government is forced to adopt those standards because the states have set the way. And then the federal government can provide funding, which it does, to, you know, close a coal-fired power plant and so forth. Like in New York State, we have, right? We have absolutely no coal-fired power plants anymore, right? So that's my question to you about, I have a question about that waiver system and what's he actually saying there?
That's a good comparison, because the fiscal, it illustrates the important role of the federal government in a federalized system, because a state like Mississippi or Alabama, whose economy is a fraction of the size of the state of California, could not afford to implement a lot of these initiatives and regulations. They couldn't, they would not, because they would not be willing to tax themselves to do the power plants and get rid of the coal plants and so forth, without that carrot, if you will, saying that, the writing's on the wall, we're going to regulate it away if you don't deal with it, but we'll give you some money to address it, which they don't have. And that's how we've developed some of the pollution control systems that we have now. As imperfect as they may be, they're still better than they would have been if we hadn't had that kind of federalism. So it's, you know, of course, where do we go from here?
I think that comparison too from the state, comparing, like you said, California to Germany is important, because as we're talking about comparing our own states, we're talking about the chart in the book shows that the higher the spending, the better the outcomes. But then when you compare to other countries, that's not the case, right? In other countries, right, we're spending more than other countries and we have the worst outcomes.
Oh, in healthcare, clearly.
Right, in healthcare, right? Yeah.
Healthcare, clearly, as you all know,
Yeah.
it's follow the money, and we're number one per capita, as percent of GDP, any measure in terms of how much we're spending, and in most areas we are nowhere close to number one in outcomes.
The one stat I liked related to healthcare said in 2060. Well, the whole healthcare argument, you felt the weight of it, because right now we're going through that right now, right? With the burden of all the aging population, the boomer generation and everything, and all the, challenges to deal with there. And they're talking about 2060, 1 in every 4 Americans will be over 65, and the citizens over 100 years old will be 6-fold. So that's like kind of a bittersweet stat, right?
Yeah.
People are going to be living longer, but then the problem's just going to get worse.
Well, see, the robots will be running the economy and generating all the income, so we can just kick back.
That's an argument for universal income, I think.
Exactly.
You know, and there's only so many dimensions that he can lay out, but you know, just being involved in healthcare, and there's so much of and he doesn't mention Medicare, which I think is interesting, because it is, you know, as a counterbalance to his argument to Medicaid. But I mean, so much of Medicare and Medicaid, to a certain extent, is managed by companies. It's not, you know, it's, you know, and I think that, you know, how much is this move to federalism also move to other non-government actors? And, you know, the way in which our medical system is working, and other, you know, kind of sacrosanct, you know, public institutions, jails, and perhaps you could mention schools, are really being managed by third parties. And then you kind of cross the line to where that management becomes policymaking. So I think it's hard to talk about federalism now without talking about kind of this non-governmental piece.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to think about how, you know, the federal government really doesn't do much of anything anymore. You know, I mean, all they do is essentially write checks. You know, and if you think of, you know, who's setting policy, state and local governments are now setting policy. You know, not much policy is coming out of DC. It's you know, state and local actors who are, you know, determining policies and then getting, you know, grants from the federal government to administer those policies.
Yeah, essentially the federal government is a large insurer with a military.
Yeah, that's a really good point you guys are making, because did you read that book, Bring Back the Bureaucrats by John DeLulio? That's what he argues, that the federal government just writing checks, administering contracts. That's what all my former students who work for the federal government, they're administering contracts, most of them, and the board. And he argues that the federal government is giving out all this money to local, state, and of course, nonprofits and privates, and they don't have a clue how that money is being used in most cases. It's not accountable to the taxpayers. So he argues that we need to hire, I can't remember, it was 1 million more federal employees, but I mean, he's talking substantial federal employment increase just to be able to monitor the funds that are going out to all of these different entities. And of course, a lot of are private, because the defense contractors, we're not talking nonprofits there. We think of nonprofits in the healthcare field, but in social services in general, and healthcare, and maybe even education. But the real money, as we know, in the federal budget's in defense. And these are private for profit, getting our money, our taxpayers' money, and it's just not accountable, according to him. It's a pretty interesting book.
Well, I mean, his point about the military, I mean, I think the sheer size of it, and you know, the $100,000 toilet seats, and the $17,000 drip pans and that kind of thing. That's the nature of how, again, with the federalized system, why do you have a 17,000 drip pan for a helicopter, military helicopter? It's because the drip pan's made in the district of one of the Congress people on the committee. You know, why do you have programs that are run by major aerospace companies that you just can't kill out for love or money? This new stealth fighter was one of the fighters that's never worked right for the Navy. And they spent billions and billions of dollars, and the companies have literally structured it so pieces of all of this stuff are made all over the country. So they're in many districts. And that's why some of these programs are so hard to kill. And it's also one of the reasons they're not very efficient. They cost more because when you're trying to coordinate many manufacturing locations and various parts and stuff, you have trouble. It's not as effective, but it's developed that way because of the funding system under our federal system. Interesting. And the other thing is that the defense budget is the biggest of the discretionary budget. It's not quite half anymore, but it's pushing it. But discretionary budget's only a third of what the federal government spends. Most of what the federal government spends are mandated programs, including Social Security,
Medicaid and
Medicare,
Medicare.
and Medicaid. Yeah, the health programs are the big kahunas, and the bigger exposure to the federal government, ironically, is not Social Security, it's Medicare, because it's underfunded. The payroll tax for Medicare is much smaller. It applies to all wages. That's the difference between Social Security. Social Security only goes up to, I think, what, Brian, is 137,000 this year or something like that, and then your Social Security tax goes to zero, and that's a problem from an equity standpoint. But it makes it harder to get a handle and control things because of the bifurcated nature of how we operate.
Well, it's just amazing that it hasn't been solved yet. Reducing the cost, it's blowing up, our state government budgets. It's blowing up our federal government budget, and yet we can't seem to rein in cost. And that's amazing.
But then all you hear are people saying we need to put the federal government on a diet, and there needs to be less employees when they've had the same amount of employees since Eisenhower.
Yeah,
And
it's way down. It's not the number of employees. It's most of the money is being spent on services and is being spent in the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that sentiment is just people, the anti-government sentiment, and it touches on that in the book too. How the local government gets all the accolades, right?
As they should, Brian.
As we should.
I'm there with you.
But we're so dependent on state and federal grants at the local level too. So it's is what it is.
Yeah, I'm a firefighter. Nobody likes a government employee more than a fire truck, right? Everyone loves a fire truck,
especially when they need them.
Yeah.
No, it's just, he quotes Tocqueville and with the freedom versus equity, equity versus freedom. And, I'd never seen, we were new to equity, or equality rather. And other, states were new to freedom, and we're still here. It's just fighting against that. It's so deeply ingrained with who we are. And, what do you do with that? And obviously it's a lot of good has come from that. But it's tough when you get down to, trying to make sure a concern about equality. It's just, but yeah.
Well, it's you just think of, the, in the 60s when, the South was all Democratic, and then, the Civil Rights Act passed, and slowly those people became Republicans. But, before that point in time, they were all in favor of government spending, and it's difficult to sort of separate these conversations from race, because, post Civil Rights, legislation, the South became more and more anti-government intervention, where, before that, from, the Great Depression till the Civil Rights era, they were generally in favor of, government handouts.
Well, yeah. And Lyndon Johnson's famously quoted as saying that, as soon as it passed, it was the right thing to do, but I fear we've lost the South for a generation. Yeah. And it's going to be more than a generation, although it's starting to change. Mm-hmm. But it is taking that time, and it does come back down to race, because that's that's the dog whistle that got Ronald Reagan elected, and that was the start of changes to the country that kind of reversed the New Deal and reversed a lot of the programs, or reduced the effectiveness of a lot of programs under FDR and Johnson, for that matter, a Great Society, and it was that rebound reaction to it. But they used the dog whistle to get themselves elected and maintain power and take over the South, and they're still trying to mine that to this day.
Amazing to me, the story about how Reagan wanted to take back Medicaid for welfare. That it's just it's what a story.
Yeah.
What a bad deal that was.
I never heard that before until this book.
I think
While I was reading, I kept thinking back to times where I've been on both sides too, where I've thought Hamiltonian, ways, and on the side of Madison, where something crazy is happening in some state. And I'm like, why do we allow this to happen anymore? Why don't we have some? And then other times New York has pushed something through, and I've been like, that's right, we don't need to listen to anyone. If you don't like it, move to a different state. I've thought in my own internal struggle is the same.
Well, and in point of fact, people have moved. People have moved. They've moved where they feel more comfortable living. And that's kind of reinforcing some of the problems we're having with these camps, the rural-urban divide, the racial divides, because people have chosen, they've chosen to move physically, they've chosen to move metaphorically or intellectually in terms of where they consume their news. If you tune to one channel, you would think that we're in that vaccine's going to kill you tomorrow.
Yeah, it would be, just thinking out loud, interesting to lay out his argument. But to get back to what you were saying, Lori, and everyone's saying, is the rural urban. I mean, to use metropolitan areas instead of states, or it just because it would cut more severely. I mean, I think that it's not state versus state. I mean, I don't think people in New York State usually have an allegiance to New York, but they have an allegiance to place, right? And it'll just be I think I don't know, just it's I think that's the toughest nut to crack. And of course there's an overlay, of course, of race, but it's just I mean, that to me, I grew up, a little hour south of here, and it's like a different world in Sardinia, New York, in Erie County, no less. It's
Well, think of, like every couple of years there's somebody coming around with a petition to separate Western New York or upstate New York from the rest of New York State. I just read something yesterday where, there's a petition in Oregon, to separate Oregon and join Idaho. And so, people are trying to, move their, their political representation to a neighboring area where they feel more comfortable.
California's had moves along that lines too, to basically
Yeah.
say LA, San Francisco, bye, the rest of us are leaving. The only problem is they don't have an economy if they say goodbye to
right. Same with us.
in San Francisco.
Yeah. But he does mention gerrymandering, but he doesn't stick on it. He only kind of brushes on it. But that's a big part of this.
I had a coworker one time try to go on this whole rant about separating from downstate New York, and union firefighter. I said, I guess you don't want your pension anymore then, because that's gone. That also bringing the conversation locally about moving. I see that also. We see it with residency requirements, right? Like in Niagara Falls, the teachers are trying to get rid of the residency requirement. As soon as they're able to, they're out of here. If they're allowed to. And I see that.
So you're a Niagara Falls firefighter?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
Well, no, it's the city outside of Minneapolis, where the 20-year-old young father was killed. Not one police officer lives in that city.
Right.
None. None.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
and
there's no residency requirement for Buffalo Police and Fire. Okay.
yeah.
for in New York State, it's there's a state law that they can live anywhere in the county because of downstate firefighters argued we
Okay.
can't. If I work in Manhattan, I can't afford to live in Manhattan.
Yeah,
So
and
we're
that's a valid argument too.
yeah. So firefighters are exempt, but but you can negotiate it away.
Yeah.
So like our police, for example, just recently in their last contract, they negotiated after 10 years, they're allowed to move outside of the county and adjoining counties.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
And then, and you can create incentive systems, so you don't have to make it mandatory, but incentive pays or assistance with housing to encourage new recruits to live in the community for a period of time,
I'm always trolling my captain because he lives out in Barker, and I'm always telling him that's why this next contract we need to negotiate a commuter tax on non-residents. get them worked up.
Yep.
Well, we're getting on 8 o'clock. I don't know if folks got to jump other places, but I mean, just before we jump off, I mean, kind of thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs sideways, whatever. I mean, I think it, was definitely for me worth the read. I mean,
And it's Zoom again. Yep. Yeah, Chris, if you can hear us, you probably try to need to log back. There he is. We can hear you again.
oh,
You froze there for a minute.
hey.
You unfroze. You were frozen for a bit.
Why
Oh,
start over again?
Yeah. I like the book. I think there's a lot of content. I think he does a great job with tons of content. I don't think he started this, it might be short on solutions, but I think it sets up a really interesting argument about federalism in this country and kind of the role of the way that the different levels of government do or do not talk to each other. So I would recommend it. It kind of falls down in places, particularly its New York State history. But but I thought I wanted to open up to see what other folks thought about it.
I thought it was thought provoking. It was worth a read, but I don't agree with the central thesis of the book. I'm of the opinion that the national government is probably going to de-evolve over the next 20 years or so. So I know a lot of people don't agree with that opinion, but it's interesting to think of these challenges that we are having in a federalism lights.
Yeah, I think it made me think about just the way things have been. I particularly enjoyed the going back in time through history to see how so many of the issues we're dealing with today, where their roots really came from.
Yeah, I think that was my favorite part about too, connecting to the history. I loved reading, the part of the beginning. I think it was somewhere in the beginning about Benjamin Franklin. They were even getting into like, choosing the national bird and all that. That stuff hooks me in. I don't know. I like that. And then, he tied it into present day. I think it was a little thin the way he did it, just by saying, by defining the national politics of the day as just TV personality talking points. He didn't really get into that, but that's okay. I think he did a good job anyway.
I feel like he started the book before Donald Trump and finished it afterward.
Yeah, it came out in an unfortunate time for him, I would think, because it came out just as the pandemic was starting. I think March of 2020 or something, it came out. But I thought it was definitely worth the read. I mean, I've read a lot of Don Kettl, and I've assigned one of his books in my Introduction to Public Administration and Policy for off and on. I mean, because there's a second edition now, so I've been able to assign that because he's updated it. And I thought there were some examples from history that I wasn't aware of some of the detail, and I really got a kick out of that. Some of the anecdotes I really got a kick out of. But I'm with Brian, thought-provoking, but I don't agree with the thesis. And that's why you're going to see on Public Service Recognition Week, it was a nod to the book club, where I call my paper New York State's Madisonian Moment. As I figured the book club would probably be at Public Service Recognition Week. So I actually named my talk for you guys. You see what you think.
I love it. Cuomo is Madison.
Yeah, I say the Green New Deal is New York State's Madisonian moment, the CLCPA, and that it's got a lot of equity in there. 40% of all the money for any energy project has to go to disadvantaged neighborhoods. And Kettl says that federalism not only doesn't provide equity, he said even within states, there's this huge problem. And of course, yeah, New York State's the second per capita income. We're right behind Luxembourg. We're the second richest if you just go by per capita. But of course, if you look at our distribution of wealth in New York State, I mean, it's really just all those rich people on Wall Street.
Right.
And we're going to soak it to them in this budget. So
you need median income, forget about per capita and averages. You got to look at the medians, and then New York State.
Exactly. But, and so you could argue, okay, New York State, it's not very equitable. And that's what he's trying to say. He actually says that in the book, doesn't he? Within states, it's a problem because he's trying to argue you need the federal government because even states don't do a good job. But I have to argue that's not the case in New York State, that there's nothing we can do. Wall Street, you just make a lot of money on Wall Street. And if it wasn't for Wall Street, we wouldn't have the State University of New York because they're financing it.
Well, I'll argue with you there in that I think our overall capacity to generate tax revenue and support public services would be far greater if we had much less income inequality than we have now.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not saying, but what I'm saying is, so he.
But that's the whole point with Wall Street is that there's money there. I mean, their bonuses.
That's right.
Are more than multiple times what people earn in a year.
That's right.
On average, and that's it's getting out of control.
But what I'm arguing is that even within states, he said that states don't try to deal with the inequity. And in us, maybe it's the rural urban, but it's also upstate, downstate. And my argument is New York State's done a lot to do that. And if you look at the Climate Act, I mean, that's a lot of money. 40% of all that money, 33 billion over 5 years, 40% is going to be earmarked for disadvantaged communities.
Yeah, that is truly progressive. I
so again, I'm with Brian. Thoughtful analysis made me think. I thought it was well written. I'm glad I read the book, but I disagree with his thesis.
Well, and to take that one step further, I mean, the individual states like New York couldn't solve the problem of Wall Street's inequality. Because if they took serious enough steps to truly solve them, Wall Street would become Bayonne, New Jersey.
Yeah.
That's the problem of a state getting too far out in front. And that's a problem, frankly, that both New York and California are on the border of suffering from, in that they're to do all the progressive things they're trying to do without a broader national system supporting it. Their taxes are getting to the point where they're becoming unaffordable. And California is starting to see an exodus. Their growth has slowed dramatically, and there are a lot of Californians moving out of state because they can't afford to live there.
And that's probably a good thing. That's what you want.
No.
Yeah, that's what you want because there's a surplus population in California. It's exactly what you want. When things get too expensive, people go to less populated areas, and you don't want a country with vast parts of it. I mean, this country could support 1 billion people, and we're going to need to, because we can't fight the Chinese. We can't be a country with only 360 or what is it million people. We don't have enough Americans.
I think they said in the book that half the population is going to live in 4 cities, was it, or something?
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of room in the interior of the United States, and we better start having more kids and letting more immigrants in, because
I'm trying.
Did you hear about the book 1 Billion Americans by Matt Iglesias?
Yeah, that's I read a review, or I saw it on Morning Joe, and apparently the CIA and the State Department analyses are all that we have to increase our population dramatically, and they're trying to figure out a way to convince Americans. Well, Bush is doing his job, Bush too, because his new book that's come out, you know, to be more immigrant friendly, because Americans aren't having enough kids to make it for what we need to do to be able to survive.
Yeah. Well, Americans, I mean, this country is built on the backs of immigrants, and what we've done in the past, 4 or 5 years is a travesty. And we're going to pay we're already starting to pay that price, because you're having trouble filling certain technical jobs. You're having you don't have, the population's not growing, and a lot of that innovation, a lot of the leaders in corporate America and elsewhere were not originally from this country.
Well, but also what Gordy said earlier tonight on just, 1 in 4 residents being over the age of 65 by 2050 or whatever year it is. It's
2060, yeah.
2060. We're going to need the population to be able to support those people in retirements.
Yeah,
exactly. We're not as bad off as Germany or Japan, but it still isn't, it isn't desirable what's going on. It's really bad in some of those European Union countries. They're really quite worried, and they're going to have to allow more Africans in. They're going to have to, because it's a young population in Africa. They're going to have to get over their racism in Europe if they're going to survive. But
I think I was just reading in the New York Times, they're saying they were expecting a baby boom during the pandemic, and the opposite happened, right?
Economic insecurity.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely part of it, economic insecurity. And of course, the dating environment was, shall we say, curtailed a bit.
Well, I contributed 5, so I tried.
Yeah, you've done your job.
Boy.
You are, yeah.
Yeah, you guys did your jobs. You have a lot of kids. I only have one.
No, we have 4, and finally, I can't see her yet, but a grandchild.
Oh,
She's she turned a year.
Nice.
Yeah. She turned a year in January. Last time we saw her was last July.
Wow.
But Monday, both Connie and I are fully vaccinated, so trip to Columbus is in our future.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So
I think we'd want to do this again, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Great,
I think so.
great. I don't know if anybody has any idea about books. I know, Laura, you brought up the book about the 1 million federal employees, or I don't know if anyone has a burning desire to introduce a new book. I'm always open to ideas.
Yeah, that one's been around, so maybe you don't want to do that one. I mean, a new book. I haven't read a lot of reviews lately. I know that I want to read the George Bush book that's coming out, but I don't know anything of, I think there's oil paintings and then people are described or something. So I don't know if that's, so I really don't have one. I'd rather defer to someone else to pick one out.
Well, we mentioned 1 billion Americans earlier. That's a new book that's out. And then I've been reading this book called The New Localism, which is about the growing, influence of local governments.
That sounds good. I'd like that.
Yeah, I'd like either one. Sounds good to me.
I'll read whatever.
Okay. Yeah. Either one sounds good to me too.
Yeah, I think new localism. I like that.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, I'll send everybody here a link to the Amazon for it.
Okay.
Okay. Great.
All right.
Cool. Okay.
Well, thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot,
Thank
guys.
you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Good
Okay,
night.
see you-
Take care,
see you May-
everyone.
See you May 1st.